Roman generals had mapped every possible route through the Alps. They had calculated Hannibal's numbers, his provisions, his weaknesses. What they hadn't calculated was the impossible: war elephants emerging from morning fog like ancient gods of destruction, trampling through their perfect formations, while 50,000 legionnaires discovered that all their training meant nothing against creatures that shouldn't exist on a battlefield 2,000 miles from Africa. August 2, 216 BC, the plains of Cannae, southeastern Italy. Tribune. Marcus Flavius Maximus pressed his palm against the pommel of his gladius, feeling the familiar weight that had carried him through 3 campaigns in Gaul. The morning mist clung to the Aufidus River like the breath of sleeping gods, and somewhere beyond that gray veil, 80,000 Roman legionnaires prepared to face an enemy that had already done the impossible. Hannibal Barca had crossed the Alps. The Carthaginian general had brought his army, including creatures that belonged in African deserts, not Italian battlefields, across mountain passes that Roman engineers declared impassable. Now, as Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus rode between the ranks of the largest army Rome had ever assembled, the Republic's very survival hung on what would happen in the next few hours. Tribune Maximus, called Centurion Gaius Brutus, his weathered face grim beneath his transverse helmet crest. The men are asking about the elephants. Maximus had been dreading this question. For weeks, scouts had brought reports that seemed torn from fever dreams. War elephants, towering beasts that could scatter cavalry charges and crush infantry formations like a child destroying sandcastles. Most of the legionnaires had never seen an elephant. Some believed they were myths, stories invented by Carthaginian propagandists to weaken Roman morale. "Tell them what we know," Maximus replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. "Hannibal has perhaps 30 elephants remaining from his Alpine crossing. Large animals trained for war but still flesh and blood. Our pila can pierce hide. Our formations can hold." But even as he spoke these words, Maximus felt the weight of uncertainty. The manual said nothing about fighting elephants. Roman tactical doctrine, perfected through centuries of conquest, had no provisions for creatures that stood twice the height of a man and weighed as much as a siege engine. Across the field, invisible through the morning haze, lay an army that had already shattered Roman confidence at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Hannibal's forces, Carthaginian veterans, Spanish swordsmen, Gallic warriors, and Numidian cavalry, had proven that Roman invincibility was a dangerous illusion. This battle at Cannae would either restore Rome's dominance or mark the beginning of the Republic's end. Consul Paulus rode past their position, his purple cloak brilliant against the gray dawn. Behind him followed Consul Marcus Terentius Varro, the 2 men representing the divided leadership that had plagued this campaign from its beginning. Paulus favored caution, waiting for Hannibal to make a mistake. Varro demanded immediate action, arguing that Rome's numerical superiority could overwhelm any tactical cleverness. Today, Varro's voice had prevailed. "Form testudo!" Centurion Brutus bellowed, and 200 men of the 4th cohort raised their shields in the practiced turtle formation. The sound of bronze against bronze rang across the field like temple bells, a rhythm that had announced Roman authority from Britain to Egypt. Young legionnaire Titus Cassius, barely 18 and fighting his first major battle, gripped his pilum with white knuckles. "Tribune, sir," he whispered, "is it true what they say about Hannibal? That he can read a general's mind before the battle begins?" Maximus studied the boy's face, seeing his own reflection from 15 years ago. "Hannibal is cunning, soldier, but cunning has never stopped Roman steel. Remember your training, trust your brothers, and Rome will see another dawn." The mist began to thin as the sun climbed higher, revealing glimpses of the Carthaginian line across the plain. Even at this distance, Maximus could see the organized chaos of Hannibal's multinational army, the gleaming bronze of African infantry, the wild hair and painted shields of Celtic warriors, the swift movements of Numidian light cavalry, and somewhere in that formation, hidden like demons waiting to be unleashed, were the elephants. Consul Varro's voice carried across the field as he addressed the army. "Citizens of Rome, today we face an enemy who dares to bring foreign beasts against Roman discipline. Let them see what Roman courage achieves when 8 legions march as one." The cheers erupted like thunder, 80,000 voices declaring their faith in Roman destiny. But as the sound faded and the final preparations began, Maximus noticed something troubling in the morning breeze, an unfamiliar scent, wild and musky, drifting from the enemy lines. The smell of Africa, the smell of elephants preparing for war. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of Rome's greatest military disasters, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic historical chronicles. Comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching this incredible tale of ancient warfare unfold. The mist lifted like a theater curtain, revealing the stage where empires would collide. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus felt his breath catch as the full scope of Hannibal's deployment became visible across the plains of Cannae. The Carthaginian line stretched for nearly 2 miles, a tapestry of bronze and steel woven from the remnants of a dozen conquered nations. "By Mars's beard," whispered Centurion Brutus, lowering his hand from shading his eyes. "Look at the center. There, positioned like dark islands in a sea of human warriors, stood the elephants. 30 magnificent beasts, each bearing a wooden tower filled with Carthaginian archers. Their gray hides gleamed with oil and war paint. Their tusks had been sharpened and capped with bronze points that caught the morning sun like deadly mirrors. Even at a distance of half a mile, their presence dominated the battlefield with an aura of primordial terror. Young Titus Cassius took an involuntary step backward. They're enormous, sir. How do we fight something like that?" Maximus placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. "The same way our ancestors fought the Gallic giants at Allia, soldier. The same way we broke the phalanxes of Pyrrhus. Discipline, formation, Roman steel." But privately, Maximus wondered if Roman steel would be enough. The elephants weren't just weapons. They were psychological warfare made flesh. Every legionnaire in the Roman line could see them now, and he watched the ripple of unease spread through the ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Consul Paulus rode up to their position, his face grave beneath his gilded helmet. "Tribune Maximus, your cohort will anchor the right wing with the triarii. If those beasts break through our center, you're our final line." "Understood, Consul. The 4th cohort will hold." Paulus studied the enemy formation with the eye of a veteran who had survived 20 years of warfare. "Hannibal has positioned his weakest troops in the center, Gauls and Spanish levies. His African veterans guard the flanks in those damned elephants." He paused, watching one of the great beasts rear up on its hind legs during a training exercise. "Those elephants are his opening gambit." "What are your orders if they charge our line?" Maximus asked. "Survive the first impact. Everything depends on surviving the first impact." As Paulus rode away to inspect other sections of the line, Centurion Brutus gathered the cohort's surviving centurions around him. These were men who had bled together from Sicily to Spain, their faces bearing the accumulated scars of a dozen campaigns. "Listen carefully," Brutus said, his voice low but carrying. "Those beasts can't turn quickly once they charge. If they break through, they'll continue straight. Don't try to be heroes. Let them pass and reform behind them. The real fight will be with the infantry following in their wake." Centurion Lucius Decidius, a grizzled veteran whose left arm bore the twisted scar of a Gallic spear, spat into the dust. "In Gaul we faced their chariots. In Spain, their cavalry. Now Africa sends us monsters from the world's edge. What's next? Dragons?" The nervous laughter that followed was cut short by the sound of Carthaginian war horns, deep resonant notes that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, announcing that Hannibal was ready to begin the dance of death. Across the field, the enemy line began to move. Not a charge, not yet, but the subtle adjustments of a master tactician positioning his pieces for maximum effect. The elephants swayed forward, their mahouts, the skilled trainers who rode atop their necks, beginning the ancient chants that would drive the beasts into combat fury. "Form ranks," Maximus commanded, and 200 Roman soldiers arranged themselves in the precise formations that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The hastati in front with their javelins, the principes behind with short swords and heavy shields, and finally the triarii, the veterans like himself who would either seal victory or die trying to prevent catastrophe. Young Titus found himself in the front rank, his face pale but determined. The boy had volunteered for the hastati despite his inexperience, driven by the same fierce pride that had built the Roman Empire 1 bloody mile at a time. "Tribune," Titus called out, "my father fought at Zama against the Numidians. He always said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear." Maximus nodded approvingly. "Your father was wise, soldier. Today you'll understand what he meant." The Carthaginian horns sounded again, closer now, and this time they were answered by the deeper blast of Roman bucinae. The signal was clear. Battle was about to commence. Somewhere in the enemy lines, Hannibal himself, The man who had sworn a blood oath to destroy Rome was making his final preparations. As if responding to some invisible command, all 30 elephants raised their trunks and trumpeted in unison. The sound rolled across the plains like thunder, a primordial roar that spoke of jungles and ancient mysteries that Rome had never encountered. For a moment, every Roman soldier on that field felt the weight of facing something beyond their understanding. Then discipline reasserted itself, and 80,000 voices rose in the traditional war cry, Roma Invicta. The elephant handlers began their final preparations, painting symbols on the great beasts' foreheads and feeding them wine mixed with herbs to heighten their aggression. Soon, very soon, these creatures would be unleashed against formations that had never faced anything like them. The first javelin flew at precisely the 3rd hour after dawn. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus watched the bronze point arc through the morning air like a deadly messenger, launched by a Numidian skirmisher who had crept too close to the Roman lines. It struck the shield of Legionnaire Marcus Antonius with a sharp crack that echoed across the battlefield like the breaking of fate itself. "Skirmishers forward!" Centurion Brutus roared, and 100 velites, Rome's light infantry, sprinted ahead of the main formation. Their job was simple: harass the enemy, disrupt their formations, and return alive if possible. But as the Roman skirmishers advanced, something unexpected happened. The Carthaginian line began to move, not forward in a traditional charge, but backward, drawing the Romans deeper into the plain. Hannibal was implementing a strategy that no Roman general had ever encountered, a tactical retreat designed to stretch Roman formations to their breaking point. "It's a trap," muttered Centurion Lucius Decidius, his scarred hand tightening on his gladius hilt. "That bastard is trying to pull us out of position." Maximus felt the same unease crawling up his spine. Hannibal's reputation for tactical genius wasn't built on myths. It was carved from the bones of Roman armies that had underestimated him. But Consul Vero, commanding from the center, seemed oblivious to the danger. His signals continued to push the Roman advance forward, chasing an enemy that appeared to be fleeing. Then the ground began to tremble. At first, Maximus thought it was the marching of 80,000 feet, but this was different, deeper, more rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Young Titus Cassius looked back with wide eyes, his pilum trembling in his grip. "Tribune, what is that sound?" Before Maximus could answer, the mist that still clung to pockets of the battlefield suddenly erupted. Through the gray veil came a sight that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. 30 war elephants in full charge, their bronze-capped tusks gleaming like the weapons of gods, their trumpeting cries drowning out the screams of men. But these weren't wild beasts mindlessly rushing forward. Each elephant moved with terrifying precision, guided by skilled mahouts who had trained for this moment their entire lives. Carthaginian infantry jogged alongside the great beasts, using them as mobile fortresses while they hurled javelins at the disrupted Roman formations. "Form testudo!" Maximus commanded, but he knew it was already too late. The Roman skirmishers caught in the open were scattering like leaves before a hurricane. Some tried to stand and fight, their pila bouncing harmlessly off the elephants' thick hides, while others simply ran, their nerve broken by creatures that seemed to emerge from the nightmares of ancient myths. The first elephant reached the Roman hastati line with the force of an avalanche. Maximus watched in horror as the beast's tusks swept through a squad of soldiers like a farmer's scythe through wheat. Bodies flew through the air, armor crumpled like parchment, and suddenly there was a gap in the Roman line that widened with each passing second. "Rally on me!" Centurion Brutus shouted, his transverse crest making him visible above the chaos. "Close ranks! Close the gap!" But more elephants were pouring through the breach, each one followed by waves of Carthaginian infantry. The careful Roman formations, perfected through centuries of warfare, were dissolving into desperate clusters of men fighting for their lives. Young Titus Cassius found himself face to face with a charging elephant, its massive head lowering like a battering ram aimed directly at his chest. For a frozen moment, the 18-year-old soldier stared into the beast's ancient eyes and saw something that chilled him more than fear: intelligence. This creature understood exactly what it was doing. At the last second, Titus threw himself sideways, rolling beneath his shield as the elephant thundered past. A Carthaginian spearman followed in the beast's wake, his bronze point seeking Roman flesh, but Titus's gladius found him first, a thrust to the stomach that dropped the enemy warrior in a spray of blood. "Well done, boy," Maximus called out, parrying a blow from a wild-haired Gaul. "Stay close to the standards." But the standards themselves were in danger. Across the battlefield, Roman eagles, the sacred symbols of legionary honor, were being overwhelmed by the advancing Carthaginian tide. The eagle of the 3rd Legion disappeared entirely, buried beneath a mass of African infantry that surged forward in the elephant's wake. Consul Paulus appeared through the dust and chaos, his purple cloak torn and bloody, his face grim with the realization that his worst fears were coming true. "Tribune Maximus, pull your men back to the 2nd line. We're reforming on the hill." "What about the center?" Maximus shouted over the din of battle. "The center is gone," Paulus replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man watching his world collapse. "Varro pushed too far forward. Hannibal's pincer is closing." As if to emphasize the consul's words, the sound of Carthaginian war horns echoed from the Roman flanks. Hannibal's African veterans, his most elite troops, were beginning their encirclement maneuver. The trap that had seemed obvious to experienced officers like Maximus and Brutus was finally springing shut, and Rome's largest army was about to become Rome's greatest disaster. An elephant emerged from the smoke directly ahead of their position, its mahout directing it toward the cluster of Roman standards that marked the 4th cohort's position. Blood dripped from the beast's tusks, and its eyes held the wild fury of a creature driven beyond natural behavior by the drugs and training of its handlers. "Brace for impact," Maximus commanded, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether any of them would live to see another Roman dawn. The elephant's charge shattered the morning air like thunder-splitting stone. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus felt time stretch as the massive beast bore down on their position, its bronze-capped tusks aimed directly at the heart of the 4th cohort's formation. Behind him, he heard young Titus Cassius whisper a prayer to Mars, the words barely audible above the creature's earth-shaking footfalls. "Pila," Maximus commanded, and 20 javelins flew toward the charging elephant. Most struck the beast's thick hide and bounced away like twigs thrown against a fortress wall. But one, hurled by Centurion Brutus with the precision of 30 years' experience, found its mark in the creature's left eye. The elephant's trumpet of pain could be heard across the entire battlefield. It reared up on its hind legs, pawing at the air with tusks that dripped crimson, while its mahout fought desperately to maintain control. For a moment Maximus dared to hope that Roman discipline had found a way to stop the unstoppable. Then the beast came down like a falling mountain. Its front feet struck the ground with such force that Legionnaires 30 paces away stumbled. The wounded eye only seemed to fuel its rage, and now it charged not with trained precision but with the wild fury of a creature driven beyond reason by pain and the drugs coursing through its blood. "Scatter!" Maximus shouted, but there was nowhere to run. The Roman formation, designed to hold against human enemies, had no answer for a 6-ton engine of destruction, guided by ancient African warfare techniques that predated Roman civilization itself. The elephant hit their line like a boulder thrown by the gods. Legionnaire Marcus Antonius, the same soldier who had taken the first Numidian javelin on his shield, disappeared beneath massive feet that left crimson impressions in the dust. His scream lasted only a moment before being crushed into silence. Young Titus Cassius threw himself behind his shield, feeling the wind of the elephant's passage as it thundered past him. A Carthaginian spearman leaped from the beast's back, his African features painted with symbols that spoke of desert gods and blood rituals. The man's bronze spear point sought Titus's throat, but Roman training saved the boy's life. His gladius came up in a perfect thrust that opened the warrior's chest like a butcher preparing meat. "Rally on the standards," Centurion Brutus roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. The old soldier stood like a pillar of Roman iron amid the swirling madness, his gladius dripping with enemy blood. Around him, the survivors of his century formed a defensive circle, their shields locked in the testudo formation that had conquered half the world. But the elephant wasn't finished. Guided by its mahout, a skilled trainer whose family had served Carthaginian generals for 3 generations, the beast wheeled around for another charge. This time, however, something had changed in its movements. The wound to its eye had awakened something primal and terrible, something that no amount of training could fully control. Maximus watched in horrified fascination as the elephant began to attack indiscriminately. Carthaginian infantry scattered as the maddened beast trampled through their ranks, its trunk lashing out at anything that moved. The mahout's commands, shouted in the ancient Punic language that had echoed across Mediterranean battlefields for centuries, seemed to have no effect. "The beast has turned," Centurion Decidius called out, his scarred face breaking into a grim smile. "Their own monster betrays them." It was true. The wounded elephant, driven mad by pain and the combat drugs, was now attacking its own side. Carthaginian soldiers dove for cover, as massive feet crushed their formations with the same indifference they had shown Roman lines moments before. The mahout, realizing he had lost control, reached for the bronze spike that every elephant handler carried, the tool of last resort that would drive through the beast's skull and end its rampage. But before he could use it, a Roman pilum, thrown with desperate accuracy by young Titus Cassius, took the mahout in the chest. The trainer tumbled from the elephant's neck, his controlling influence gone forever. Now truly masterless, the beast became a force of pure destruction that recognized no allegiance to any flag. Across the battlefield, similar scenes were unfolding. Of Hannibal's 30 war elephants, nearly half had succumbed to the madness that came with serious wounds. The creatures that were supposed to spearhead the Carthaginian victory were instead creating chaos in their own ranks, trampling African veterans and Celtic warriors with equal enthusiasm. Consul Paulus seized the moment with the instincts of a commander who had survived 2 decades of warfare. "Advance," he commanded, his voice carrying across the Roman lines. "Their beasts turn against them. Press the advantage." But even as he spoke, Maximus could see the larger picture developing around them. Yes, some of the elephants had turned, creating havoc in Carthaginian formations, but the majority of Hannibal's forces, his disciplined African infantry, his swift Numidian cavalry, his veteran Spanish swordsmen, were executing their assigned roles with mechanical precision. The trap was still closing. While Roman attention focused on the spectacular elephant rampage, Hannibal's real strategy continued to unfold. His weak center, deliberately placed to tempt Roman aggression, was giving ground in exactly the pattern he had planned. The Roman army, drawn forward by what seemed like Carthaginian retreat, was being funneled into a killing ground where superior numbers would mean nothing. "Tribune," Titus Cassius pointed toward the flanks, his young eyes sharper than those of the veterans around him. "Look at their cavalry." Maximus turned and felt his blood turn to ice water. Numidian horsemen, the finest light cavalry in the Mediterranean world, were sweeping around both Roman flanks in perfect coordination. Soon they would be attacking from behind, completing the encirclement that would turn Rome's largest army into Rome's greatest catastrophe. The elephant that had begun this phase of the battle was still rampaging, now completely mad and attacking anything within reach, but its destruction was no longer the main threat. The real danger was the methodical precision with which Hannibal's human soldiers were executing a plan that would be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. "Brutus," Maximus called to his old friend, "can you see Consul Varro's position?" The centurion shaded his eyes and scanned the battlefield. When he turned back, his face was gray. "Gone, sir. The center has collapsed completely. If Varro still lives, he's fighting as a common soldier now." The sound that chilled Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus to his very soul wasn't the trumpeting of elephants or the clash of bronze on bronze. It was silence, the sudden unnatural quiet that fell over the Roman center as 80,000 voices realized, almost simultaneously, that they had walked into the most perfectly executed trap in military history. Hannibal's plan revealed itself like a scroll unrolling to show a master calligrapher's work. The Carthaginian center, which had appeared to flee in disorder, had instead drawn the Roman legions into a killing pocket. African veterans, Hannibal's finest troops, now emerged from concealed positions on both flanks, their bronze armor gleaming like the scales of some enormous serpent coiling around its prey. "Form square," Centurion Brutus commanded, but his voice carried the hollow note of a man who understood that formations meant nothing when the enemy held every tactical advantage. The 4th cohort drew together, shields locked, spears outward, but they were no longer part of a Roman army. They were an island of desperate men in a sea of enemies. Young Titus Cassius, his pilum already bloodied from the elephant encounter, pressed close to Maximus. "Tribune, sir," he whispered, "are we going to die here?" Before Maximus could answer, a new horror revealed itself. Through the dust and chaos came a sight that made even veteran legionnaires take involuntary steps backward. Numidian cavalry, moving with the fluid grace of desert predators, were systematically hunting down Roman officers. They targeted the transverse crests of centurions, the bronze torques of tribunes, anyone whose rank made them valuable for the psychological impact of their death. Centurion Lucius Decidius watched 3 horsemen approach his position with the calculating eyes of a man who had survived 20 years of frontier warfare. "They're not trying to break us quickly," he observed with professional detachment. "They want us to suffer. They want word of this defeat to reach Rome with all the horror intact." And horror it was. Across the battlefield, the disciplined rectangles of Roman legions were dissolving into desperate clusters of men, fighting back-to-back against impossible odds. The eagle standards, those sacred symbols that no Roman soldier would willingly abandon, were falling one by one. Each captured eagle represented not just a tactical defeat, but a spiritual wound that would scar the Roman psyche for generations. Consul Paulus appeared through the swirling dust, his horse limping from a Numidian spear thrust. Blood ran freely from a gash across his forehead, and his purple cloak hung in tatters, but his eyes still held the fierce determination that had carried him through 2 decades of command. "Tribune Maximus," he called out, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle. "Can your cohort reach the river?" Maximus studied the ground between their position and the Aufidus River, now barely visible through the haze of dust and smoke. Carthaginian infantry controlled every route, and Numidian cavalry prowled the spaces between like wolves, selecting which sheep to slaughter next. "It would be suicide, Consul. We'd be cut down before we covered half the distance." Paulus nodded grimly. "Then we make our stand here. If Rome is to lose her greatest army, let it be said that her soldiers died as Romans." But even as the consul spoke these brave words, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. The elephant that had rampaged through both armies earlier had finally collapsed from its wounds, creating a small mountain of flesh that blocked one of the few remaining escape routes. Carthaginian engineers, soldiers trained in the sophisticated warfare techniques that Hannibal had learned during his campaigns across the Mediterranean, were already positioning artillery to command the killing ground where Roman survivors huddled. Young Titus Cassius had been listening to the exchange between Maximus and Paulus with the wide-eyed attention of a boy, trying to understand how the world worked. Now he stepped forward, his gladius steady despite his obvious fear. "Sir," he addressed the consul directly, "my father always said that Romans don't surrender. Not to Gauls, not to Germans, not to anyone. If we're going to die, shouldn't we die advancing?" Paulus studied the young soldier with something approaching paternal pride. "What's your name, Legionnaire?" "Titus Cassius, sir. 18th year, first campaign." "Well, Titus Cassius, your father raised a Roman. Yes, if we're going to fall, we'll fall with our faces toward the enemy." Around them, the sounds of battle were shifting. The clash of weapons against shields was giving way to something more ominous, the systematic noise of pursuit and slaughter. Hannibal's forces were no longer fighting a battle. They were conducting an execution. Centurion Brutus pointed toward a cluster of Roman standards that still flew defiantly in the center of the killing ground. "The 1st and 2nd legions are still holding position near the old camp. If we can reach them, we form the final defensive line," Maximus finished. It wasn't a plan for victory. Victory was no longer possible. It was a plan for dying with honor, which was sometimes the only choice left to Roman soldiers. But as they prepared to move, something unexpected happened. From the enemy lines came the sound of Carthaginian horns, but these weren't the triumphant notes of victory. These were signals of confusion. Messages passed rapidly between commanders who were dealing with an unforeseen complication. "What is that?" Titus asked, straining to see through the dust. Maximus shaded his eyes and peered toward the Carthaginian positions. What he saw there defied immediate understanding. Some of Hannibal's elephants, the ones that hadn't been driven mad by wounds, were refusing to advance. Their mahouts were striking them with the bronze goads used to control the beasts, but the elephants stood motionless, their ancient eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to understand something their human controllers did not. "The beasts are afraid," Centurion Decidius said wonderingly. "Something has frightened creatures that fear nothing." As if in answer to his words, a new sound rolled across the battlefield. Not human voices or animal cries, but something else. A deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The earth trembled with a rhythm that belonged neither to marching feet nor charging cavalry. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus felt it through the soles of his caligae, a deep, primordial pulse that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. Around him, the sounds of battle began to fade as both Roman and Carthaginian warriors paused to identify this new presence on the field. Then through the haze of dust and smoke that had turned the plains of Cannae into a hellscape, they appeared. More elephants. But these weren't Hannibal's trained war beasts. These were creatures in full panic, stampeding directly toward the battlefield from the Carthaginian camp. Something had spooked the reserve animals, and now 20 additional elephants were charging in complete disorder, their mahouts either thrown or clinging desperately to their necks. "By all the gods," whispered Centurion Brutus, his weathered face reflecting the awe of a man witnessing forces beyond human control. They're running wild. The stampede struck the Carthaginian lines like a natural disaster made flesh. African veterans who had maintained perfect discipline throughout the battle scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The careful formations that Hannibal had positioned to complete his encirclement dissolved as 20 panicked elephants trampled through their ranks without distinction between friend and enemy. Young Titus Cassius watched in fascination as one of the stampeding beasts, a massive bull elephant with broken chains hanging from its legs, charged directly through a phalanx of Spanish infantry. Bodies flew through the air like broken dolls, and the screams of men and animals merged into a sound that belonged in the deepest circles of Hades. "This is our chance," Consul Paulus declared, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a man who had spent his life seizing moments of opportunity. "The center of their line is collapsing. If we move now—" But even as he spoke, the situation grew more complex. The stampeding elephants weren't discriminating in their targets. One of the creatures, foam flying from its mouth in the madness of absolute terror, veered toward the remnants of the fourth cohort. "Form testudo," Maximus commanded, and his men locked shields with the automatic precision of soldiers whose survival depended on muscle memory. The elephant struck their formation like a boulder hurled by siege engines, and for a moment, the world became nothing but crushing weight and the splintering of wood and bronze. When the beast passed, 3 men were dead, and twice that number wounded. But they had held. The Roman formation had absorbed an impact that should have scattered them like dust, and they remained intact as a fighting unit. Centurion Lucius Decidius, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where an elephant's foot had grazed his helmet, laughed with the wild joy of a man who had survived the impossible. "Still standing," he roared. "Rome endures." His cry was taken up by other survivors across the battlefield. Despite the catastrophic losses, despite the tactical brilliance of Hannibal's trap, something indomitable in the Roman spirit refused to break. Here and there, clusters of legionnaires maintained their formations, their standards still flying defiantly above the carnage. But Hannibal himself was not a general who yielded to chaos, even chaos that worked against him. Through the dust and madness of the elephant stampede, his command signals could still be heard, African drums beating in complex rhythms that reorganized his scattered forces with remarkable speed. "He's adapting," Maximus observed with professional admiration for an enemy who was proving worthy of his fearsome reputation. Even this he turns to advantage. It was true. While the stampeding elephants created havoc in Carthaginian formations, they were also driving surviving Roman units away from each other, preventing any coordinated breakout attempt. What had seemed like an opportunity for Roman escape was being transformed into another layer of the tactical web that Hannibal had been weaving since dawn. Young Titus Cassius, his gladius now notched from combat and his shield scarred by elephant tusks, moved closer to Maximus. The boy had aged years in the span of hours, his face bearing the 1,000-yard stare that came to soldiers who had looked into the abyss of their own mortality and somehow stepped back. "Tribune," he said quietly, "I can see Roman eagles to the south. The 3rd and 7th legions are still fighting." Maximus followed the boy's gaze and confirmed the sight that gave him the first hope he had felt since the battle began. Perhaps 2 miles away, partially obscured by the smoke of burning supply wagons, the bronze eagles of Roman legions still caught the sunlight. Somewhere in that direction, Roman soldiers were making the same choice they were making here, to stand and fight rather than flee and die running. Consul Paulus had seen it too. "Tribune Maximus, can your cohort fight its way to those positions?" Before Maximus could answer, the decision was made for them. The last of the stampeding elephants had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Where ordered battle lines had existed, there was now a maze of scattered units, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of men and beasts. In this chaos, new opportunities existed, but so did new dangers. Numidian cavalry, their horses trained to move carefully around elephant sign, were already beginning to hunt through the wreckage for Roman survivors. These weren't the massed charges of heavy cavalry. These were the methodical operations of skilled predators who understood that the real killing began after the formations broke. "Move out," Paulus commanded, fighting withdrawal toward the eagles. "Every Roman who reaches those lines is another sword for the final stand." As they began their movement across the transformed battlefield, Centurion Brutus fell into step beside Maximus. The old soldier's face was grim, but his eyes held the steady determination that had carried Rome through 3 centuries of warfare. "Sir," he said quietly. Whatever happens in the next hour, it's been an honor serving under your command. Maximus gripped his friend's shoulder, feeling the weight of 30 years of shared campaigns. The honor has been mine, Gaius. Let's see if we can give Rome one more story to remember. Around them, the survivors of the fourth cohort formed up for what might be their final march, a journey across a killing ground where every step could be their last, toward a destiny that would be decided by Roman steel and Roman courage against impossible odds. The journey across the elephant-torn battlefield became a nightmare navigation through the wreckage of Roman ambition. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus led the survivors of the fourth cohort in a fighting withdrawal that required them to step over the bodies of men they had shared bread with that morning, past the scattered equipment of legions that would never march again. Young Titus Cassius, his 18-year-old eyes now holding the hollow stare of a veteran, pointed toward a cluster of abandoned Roman shields. "Sir, those belong to the second cohort of the 5th Legion. They were positioned on our left this morning." Maximus nodded grimly. The shields bore the distinctive wolf head emblem of the 5th, but their owners were nowhere to be seen. Whether dead, fled, or captured, those men represented another piece of Rome's military might that would not return home to their families in the Seven Hills. Consul Paulus, despite his wounds and the purple cloak that marked him as a prime target for Carthaginian hunters, maintained the bearing of a commander. His horse had died from Numidian arrows an hour ago, forcing him to march on foot with common soldiers, but his voice still carried the authority that had led Rome through 2 decades of warfare. "Centurion Brutus," he called out, "what's our count?" The grizzled veteran did a quick tally of the men still capable of fighting. 63 effectives, Consul, plus 14 walking wounded who can still hold a gladius. 77 men from a cohort that had numbered 200 at dawn. The mathematics of defeat wrote themselves in Roman blood across the plains of Cannae, but somehow these survivors continued to move, continued to fight, continued to embody the stubborn refusal to yield that had built an empire from a collection of Italian hill towns. As they advanced toward the distant Roman eagles, Numidian cavalry appeared on their flanks like desert spirits materializing from heat shimmer. These horsemen didn't charge. They didn't need to. Instead, they maintained a constant pressure, forcing the Romans to march in tight formation while arrows fell among them like deadly rain. Centurion Lucius Decidius, his scarred face set in lines of professional concentration, studied the enemy cavalry with the eye of a man who had fought similar opponents in Spain. "They're hurting us," he observed, "driving us toward a killing ground of their choosing." But what choice did they have? Behind them lay the complete collapse of Roman formations. Ahead, the eagles of the 3rd and 7th Legions offered the only hope of joining a defense strong enough to exact some cost from Hannibal's victory. The midday sun had transformed the battlefield into a furnace where the bronze armor of dead soldiers reflected light like scattered mirrors. The smell of blood and death hung heavy in the air, mixed with the dust kicked up by thousands of feet and the acrid smoke from burning supply wagons. Young Titus Cassius stumbled over something and looked down to find the body of a Carthaginian officer, his bronze armor inlaid with African gold. The man's face, frozen in death, was younger than Titus himself, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. For a moment, the Roman boy stared into features that could have belonged to a brother or friend if they had been born on different sides of the Mediterranean. "Keep moving, soldier," Maximus commanded gently, understanding the thoughts that were paralyzing the young legionnaire. "Honor the dead by living. That's all any warrior can do." As they crested a low hill, the full scope of the tactical situation revealed itself. The Roman eagles they had been marching toward were indeed still flying, but the formations beneath them told a story of desperate defense rather than organized resistance. Perhaps 3,000 Roman soldiers had managed to form a defensive perimeter around the abandoned Carthaginian camp, men from a dozen different legions thrown together by catastrophe rather than design. But surrounding this final pocket of Roman resistance was the methodical precision of Hannibal's victory. Carthaginian forces had established siege lines, cutting off all escape routes while maintaining enough distance to avoid unnecessary casualties. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a siege, and everyone involved understood how sieges ended when the defenders had no supply lines and no hope of relief. Consul Paulus studied the tactical situation with the detached analysis of a professional soldier. "Hannibal offers us a choice," he said quietly. "Die quickly in a futile charge, or die slowly while he demonstrates Roman helplessness to the world. There might be a third option," Maximus suggested, pointing toward a gap in the Carthaginian lines where elephant stampede damage had not yet been fully repaired. if we time our approach correctly. But even as he spoke, they all understood the reality. 77 exhausted men, many of them wounded, could not break through professional siege lines maintained by an army that had just won the greatest tactical victory in military history. Centurion Brutus, his face bearing the accumulated scars of 3 decades of frontier warfare, gathered the men around him with the practiced efficiency of a leader who understood that words mattered in moments like these. "Romans," he said, his voice carrying across the small formation. "Our eagles still fly. Our brothers still fight. Whatever happens in the next hour, let no man say that the 4th cohort forgot what it meant to be Roman." The response was not the thunderous war cry that had shaken enemy lines that morning. Instead, it was the quiet "Ave" of men who understood that they were about to join the ranks of Rome's honored dead, soldiers who would be remembered not for victory, but for the manner of their dying. As they began their final advance toward the besieged Roman position, Titus Cassius fell into step beside Tribune Maximus. The boy's voice, when he spoke, carried a maturity that had been earned through blood and loss. "Sir," he said, "will anyone remember what happened here?" Maximus looked out over the vast cemetery that the plains of Cannae had become, then back at the young soldier who represented everything Rome had invested in its future. "They'll remember, Titus. They'll remember, and they'll learn, and somehow Rome will find a way to ensure that this never happens again." The final charge of the 4th cohort lasted exactly 17 minutes by the sundial measurements that Roman engineers would later use to document the disaster. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus led his 77 survivors across the blood-soaked ground, where 3 empires' worth of ambition had come to die, their bronze-tipped pila gleaming one last time in the afternoon sun that would set on Rome's darkest day. They reached the besieged Roman position just as Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus fell with a Numidian arrow through his throat. The man who had argued for caution, who had understood the trap before it closed, died with his gladius in his hand and Roman curse words on his lips. His purple cloak, now more crimson than imperial, settled over him like a burial shroud. Young Titus Cassius was among the first to breach the Carthaginian siege lines, his gladius opening the chest of a Gallic warrior whose painted shield bore symbols older than Rome itself. The 18-year-old boy had become a killer in the span of a single day, transformed by necessity from citizen to soldier to survivor, by the alchemy of war that had forged the Roman Empire one bloody battle at a time. But survival itself was now merely a matter of degrees. The combined Roman forces, perhaps 3,000 men from an army that had numbered 80,000 at dawn, formed their final defensive square around the scattered remains of their baggage train. Above them, 12 legion eagles still caught the light, but the men beneath those sacred standards understood that they were about to join the ranks of Rome's honored dead. Centurion Gaius Brutus, his transverse crest now split by an African spear point, gathered the survivors of his century for the last time. "Romans," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years' service to the Republic, "we have seen what one man's genius can accomplish against even Rome's might. Let us show them what Roman courage achieves when death becomes inevitable." Hannibal himself appeared at the edge of the killing ground, mounted on a Spanish war horse and surrounded by his personal guard. The Carthaginian general was younger than most of the Roman officers he had defeated, barely 30 years old, but his dark eyes held the calculating intelligence that had conceived the most perfect military victory in recorded history. He made no speech, offered no terms, granted no mercy. This was not personal vengeance but professional completion. Rome had sent its largest army to destroy him. He would send that army's remnants home as a message written in blood and bronze. Maximus found himself standing beside Titus Cassius in the final moments before the Carthaginian assault began. The boy's face, streaked with dust and enemy blood, had aged decades in a single day, but his grip on his gladius remained steady, and his eyes held the fierce light that had carried Rome from Italian city-state to Mediterranean hegemon. "Tribune," Titus said quietly, "I want you to know, this has been the greatest honor of my life." Before Maximus could respond, the Carthaginian horn sounded the final attack. African infantry, Spanish swordsmen, and Gallic warriors converged on the Roman square from all directions, while overhead, the surviving war elephants, now properly controlled, moved like gray mountains against the pale sky. The end came not with the theatrical drama of epic poetry, but with the methodical efficiency of professional soldiers completing an assigned task. Roman formations held for exactly as long as Roman training allowed, then dissolved under pressure that no amount of courage could withstand. Centurion Brutus fell beside the eagle of the 4th Legion, his body shielding the standard even in death. Centurion Decidius died sword in hand, his final blow opening the skull of a Carthaginian officer who would never again see his African homeland. Young Titus Cassius fought until a Spanish falcata took his arm, then continued fighting until loss of blood claimed what enemy steel could not. Tribune Marcus Flavius Maximus was among the last to fall, struck down while attempting to rally survivors around a broken legion standard. His final sight was of Hannibal himself, studying the carnage with the detached analysis of a surgeon examining a successful operation. By sunset, the plains of Cannae had become a monument to tactical genius and strategic catastrophe. 50,000 Roman dead carpeted the ground where grain would grow for generations, fertilized by the blood of citizens who had believed that Roman arms were invincible. But in defeat, Rome discovered something that victory had never taught: the price of overconfidence and the value of tactical innovation. The disaster at Cannae would echo through Roman consciousness for centuries, driving military reforms that would eventually produce generals like Scipio Africanus and Julius Caesar, commanders who understood that genius could arise from any nation, and that Roman victory required more than courage and tradition. Hannibal had won the perfect battle, but in doing so, he had awakened something in Rome that no military victory could destroy: the absolute determination never again to be caught unprepared. From the blood-soaked fields of Cannae would rise the tactical sophistication that would eventually make Roman legions truly invincible. The elephants that had emerged from morning fog to terrorize Roman dreams would themselves become nightmares in Carthaginian memory. For Rome learned from every defeat, adapted to every challenge, and emerged stronger from every catastrophe. The empire that rose from Cannae's ashes would remember forever the day when foreign beasts taught Roman pride the difference between confidence and arrogance. In the end, Hannibal's greatest victory became Rome's greatest lesson. The dead at Cannae had not died in vain. They had died as teachers, their blood writing the first chapters of tactical manuals that would guide Roman conquest for the next 6 centuries. The end